Hello, welcome to the Accelerated Analytics video tutorial on using exceptions to increase the effectiveness of your retail data analysis. I'm going to spend a few minutes today talking about the benefits of adding exceptions to point-of-sale reporting. I'm going to talk about some of the common exceptions that we use with our customers, and I'll review some of the reporting design considerations. Then I'll talk as a wrap-up about how to work with a business user that's having a hard time defining exceptions for you to build into their reports. It seems like when we talk to customers about report design best practices, there's nearly universal agreement that adding good quality exceptions is critical to cutting through the overwhelming volume of POS data and focusing on the right problems or opportunities. But we still get frequent requests for generic UPC store grain reports, and when we comment that that report's going to be exceptionally large and try to define what exceptions the user is looking to study, we basically get back a blank stare. But the user has something in mind that they want to find in that data. It could be low sales or low inventory or high sales. There's times that I pull a large amount of data with kind of a general idea of what I want to investigate, and I wouldn't want to define a specific exception at the start because it might eliminate some of that data that I'd find helpful to my analysis. But at the end of my analysis, and should be true for everyone watching this tutorial, at the end of my analysis, I should be able to define back the exception so that I would know and be able to reuse it again in the future. Unfortunately, I don't see that last part happening nearly often enough. The exceptions don't get defined and written back into the report, and the user does the same work over and over. And worse, several other users are often doing nearly identical tasks for their products or for their customers. So back to my earlier point. I understand the first time through you may not be able to define what exceptions you're looking for, but that should really only be true for the first time around. So now let's talk about a few reasons why exceptions are beneficial. First, exceptions help narrow the focus of the analysis to the problem or the opportunities that matter the most. Why spend time looking at hundreds or even thousands of rows of data when a small percentage of the rows are the ones that you need to focus on? Next, the exceptions create a standard method for all users to use to evaluate the data. If you have a corporate goal, for example, of reducing your out-of-stocks by, say, 4%, and 3 separate account managers are sorting their data using different weeks of supply values, there's a pretty good chance that the results are going to be inconsistent. But if you all agree on a single exception, and all 3 account managers use that exception, now everyone is on the same page and the results will be consistent. That's not to say you won't need to adjust the exception, but a consistent result can be measured and it can be adjusted. Finally, exceptions save administrative time that's often repeated by more than one team member. Not everyone is a business analyst adept at sorting and filtering and pivoting data, but by building an exception that provides the end result without requiring the user to manipulate the data, you leverage your expertise and time as an analyst. So going back to my example from earlier with the 3 account managers, what sense does it make to have 3 people sorting, filtering, and pivoting data in similar ways? It doesn't make any sense. That's 3 times the effort to get to the same answer. And maybe your exception is unique and other people on the team hadn't thought of it yet and would benefit if everyone could have it shared. The question I'm usually asked at this point is, what are some of the common exceptions? So let me give you a few examples that we see are pretty common. The most common exception is on hand is equal to 0, or commonly referred to as an out of stock. Unfortunately, while that's a useful thing to find, an out of stock situation is also too late. It's a rear view type of metric. So for an inventory exception, I prefer to use weeks of supply inventory. Weeks of supply inventory, unlike out of stock, is a leading indicator. It's constantly adjusted based on the rate of sale and the available inventory, and so you get in front of a stock out before it occurs, and you can work with your replenishment manager to get the product to the store on time. Common sales exceptions include low or high sales, which can be at a SKU or store grain. I prefer to use a percent change in sales since it's a rolling metric, and also because it incorporates in a business goal into the exception. So for example, you might have a business goal for a particular product line to increase by 5%. So if you set an exception to show any SKU store that has a percent change below 5%, you're presented with a list that needs your immediate attention. The percent change can be based on a current year period or a year-over-year period, depending on your product type and the baseline for your business goal. A couple of exceptions that I don't see very often but are worth mentioning are planned stores versus stocking stores and planned stores versus selling stores. Your planogram or your buying agreement with your buyer specifies what stores are going to carry specific SKUs. By loading that plan into your POS reporting tool, you can pretty easily create an exception which identifies stores that should have a product on hand but don't, or stores that should be selling a product but are not. In both situations, those are the stores that need your immediate attention. A final note on exceptions. Take the time to choose metrics that incorporate your business goals. In most situations, an exception that is something like on hand less than 10 isn't as useful as an exception like weeks of supply less than 3 weeks. Without doing additional math, you have no way of knowing how long 10 units of inventory is going to last, so weeks of supply is a better measure. And you can define the goal to support your real business objectives in the real world. For example, if you have a 15-day order to store delivery time, then an exception that looks for a minimum of 3 weeks of supply on-hand inventory probably makes sense because it provides 1 week to work with the replenishment manager and 2 weeks to ship the product to the store. So now that I've talked about some common exceptions and why they're important, let me talk for a bit about some of the items to consider when designing an exception report. The first design element to consider is the width of the report. Many times we see a request for an exception report that is essentially identical to a day-to-day report in terms of the columns which it might have, like last week, month to date, year to date, rolling 52 weeks, and so on. The problem is it's a very wide report. Keeping in mind that an exception report can be very long, we want to make sure to avoid a wide report because a very large set of data, wide and long, we can't easily work with. The next design recommendation is to add geographic and product category drop-downs so the user can narrow the focus of the report. There is sometimes a temptation to forego those types of filters because the user says they want to see all the stores or all the SKUs, but there are likely to be times when they only want to see a portion of the data. So having the ability to filter the report is useful. In addition, if you have different team members managing product lines or geographic areas which are different, they're going to want to view the data differently, and so those filters will help them have a more relevant report to their job. I'll wrap up with a brief tip on how to work with a business user to define an exception. If you're having difficulty getting the business users to define exceptions, I recommend that you provide a subset of the detailed data with the understanding that you want to sit down, that you want to observe how they use the data, and then as that business user works on the data, record the sorting, the filtering, the pivot tables they use. If they're adding data columns via lookup or deleting columns, record that as well. Ask questions about why they applied a certain filter or sort so you can understand what the business objective is that they're trying to satisfy. These will help you define the exceptions. Next, discuss with them the data that they need at the end of the process to make their business decisions. For example, they might only need a summary of sales for, say, a 4-week period and the current on hand. The objective is to keep the report narrow, as we talked about before, so that the data is easier to use. Observing how they use the data is really the key. When they're having a hard time writing down the exceptions that they need, you can often find them through observation. Thank you for watching the video tutorial on using exceptions for your POS reporting. I hope you found the content useful. Please take a moment to send any feedback or comments, and I will incorporate those into a future video. I'd also recommend that you visit our website and check out our resource section. There are more videos and how-to guides there. And then you can also check out the Retail Industry Briefing book in the resources section of our website. It's our monthly research report on industry trends and data which impacts the retail industry, and we've been getting very, very positive feedback on that. Thank you again for watching.